During the 1930s, high winds across central North America were carrying away precious farmland, which had been turned to dust by the drought. At the same time, too much wheat on the world market meant those farmers still able to carry on watched wheat prices fall to rock bottom. With the crash of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929, hard times spread from country to country. Fortunes were lost. Banks closed. Heavy industry and factories couldn't sell their products and soon stopped producing. All over the world, high tariffs against imports brought international trade to its knees, and jobs disappeared like more dust in the wind. People who had never invested in the stock market lost all their savings as their local banks that had failed. And they spent a lot of time standing in lines for the soup kitchens, for a bit of produce handed out by the local relief agencies, for a loaf of bread. And if a job opening could be found, thousands of the unemployed lined up for that too. Most families at this time existed on one income. When that job was gone, life became a matter of just surviving. The unemployed drifted from place to place, looking for work where there was none to find. Complicating all of this was something called the gold standard. This was the international monetary policy of the time, and it meant that every dollar of currency could be exchanged for a dollar's worth of gold at any time. So the amount of a country's gold supply could limit the amount of money circulating in the economy. In a healthy economy, money has a circular flow. Businesses employ workers and pay them wages. Workers spend their wages on products manufactured by business, and it goes round and round. If people begin to save their money by investing, in banks for instance, that money leaks out of the circular flow. But it's balanced by the lending of money from the banks to the businesses. This injects it back into the circular flow. Likewise, when governments collect taxes, that money leaks out of the flow, but it's put back in when governments spend money on public programs and infrastructure. This is the way a balanced economy should operate. But in the 30s, as people lost their jobs and their faith in banks, they began to hoard what money or gold they had. They took it out of banks and spent as little as possible. That meant that less money was circulating in the economy. It also meant that they took control of that money away from the government. As the Depression went on, prices began to drop. This is known as deflation, and they were dropping at about 10% per year. This too had the result of decreasing spending. After all, if prices would be lower tomorrow, why would you spend your money today? So, not only was the economy limited by the amount of gold available, it was further restricted by the hoarding of cash and gold, the failure of the stock market, and increasing deflation. The loyalty to the gold standard caused more problems. After the war, many countries owed money they'd borrowed for their war effort. Britain and France owed a great deal to America, as did Australia to Great Britain. The debtor countries made the bulk of their loan payments in gold bullion. As a result, by the late 20s, America controlled most of the world's supply of gold. As debtor countries watched so much of their gold leaving for the U.S., they tried to make their loan payments in goods and services. But America at this time had placed high tariffs against foreign goods. These protectionist policies backfired. If foreign countries couldn't sell their goods to America, they certainly wouldn't have the money in turn to buy American products. American protectionism had effectively killed its own overseas markets. In the U.S., a new president had been elected, and he took office in 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He had a big job ahead of him to get America back on its economic tracks, and he immediately set to work. One of his first acts was to declare a bank holiday. He closed all the banks in the country for 8 days. He did this to give the government time to come up with a plan to save the banking system. And he hoped that the bank holiday would stop people from withdrawing all their deposits. This panic had caused thousands of banks to go under. Roosevelt made the ownership of gold coins or bullion a crime, which was an attempt to stop hoarding and the first step in taking the nation off the gold standard. This had the effect of devaluing the U.S. dollar, which helped exporters. But FDR didn't stop there. Within a few weeks of taking office, he ended the prohibition of alcohol. It wasn't working anyway, and lifting it would allow the government to collect taxes on sales of alcohol. Roosevelt then set up a whole slew of government programs. There were so many of them that people started calling them the alphabet agencies. These would help to distribute emergency supplies, assist business, insure bank deposits, regulate the stock market, and subsidize home and farm mortgage payments. Other legislation brought unemployment compensation and old age security payments. All of this was part of his New Deal, which was a series of major recovery programs intended to bring the U.S. out of the Depression. In many cities, the federal government provided hot lunches for children of the poor, as well as daycare for working mothers. Roosevelt's administration also came up with the food stamp program. The stamps could be traded for food at any market. In turn, this helped farmers to sell their surplus crops. In later programs of his New Deal, Roosevelt established the Works Progress Administration. The WPA boosted the economy by giving the unemployed an income. In return, they went to work on thousands of federal projects. During this time, 78,000 bridges were built, more than 600,000 miles of new roads, and 115,000 new buildings, including schools, post offices, and hospitals. And along with local school boards and churches, the WPA organized a massive adult education program. Millions of adults would attend schools in their communities to study everything from mechanics to cooking. A great many of them were new immigrants learning English. The WPA's activities included the Federal Arts Project, which paid for work done by artists all through the U.S. They were required to produce paintings, sculptures, and murals for public buildings. They also developed art education projects. There were similar programs for writers, musicians, and actors. The Resettlement Administration made an important contribution at this time. Professional photographers were sent out to document the living and working conditions of ordinary Americans. Some of the best records of America in the 30s are the images captured by these photographers. All of this was political and economic revolution. Never before had the U.S. government intervened so dramatically in the economic, social, and cultural development of the country. It had a downside, of course. Government spending skyrocketed, and you could forget about balanced budgets. But it made Roosevelt very popular. He would enjoy an unprecedented 4 terms in office. In Canada, Prime Minister Bennett struggled to come up with solutions to the Depression. But for the most part, his government's policies were short-sighted and ineffectual. Masses of the unemployed wandered the country looking for work. In many cities, the welcoming committee was the local police. Frustrated and with little hope, these jobless men would gather on street corners near the soup kitchens with nothing to do but cause trouble. Bennett's government decided to simply get these men as far away as possible. Work camps were set up in remote locations throughout Canada. For an unemployed single man, there was little choice. If he went to a relief agency for something to eat and a roof over his head, he had to go to the camps to get it. The work was straight manual labor, building roads, clearing bush, improving parks, all of it by pickaxe and shovel. The conditions in the camps were terrible. Tar paper shacks, little heat, and poor food. The men worked 6.5 days a week for 20 cents a day. Under those conditions, it didn't take long for the men to organize and form a union, and then to walk out and protest against working conditions and wages. The federal government wasn't amused. They banned the union from the work camps and arrested anyone caught with a union card. The strikers never gave an inch. In the spring of 1935, they gathered in Vancouver demanding changes. But local authorities were unable to meet their demands. Responsibility, they said, lay with the federal government. So the strikers decided to take their protest directly to the Prime Minister. More than 1,600 men climbed onto freight trains and headed east to confront Bennett and his government. The On to Ottawa trek had begun. More than 2,000 men had joined the trek by the time they reached Saskatchewan, and that's as far as they got. Bennett ordered the RCMP to halt the trek at Regina. A meeting was quickly arranged in Ottawa with the Prime Minister and 8 union representatives, but it went badly, with insults shouted back and forth. Bennett accused the delegation of being communist agitators. The trekkers called the Prime Minister a liar. Back in Regina on July 1, 1935, the police, armed with baseball bats and tear gas, attacked a gathering of 3,000 trekkers and citizens. Caught off guard, the crowd retaliated by throwing rocks and bottles. Hundreds were injured. One police officer was killed, and one trekker died later in hospital. This became known as the Regina Riot. Eventually, the trekkers agreed to return to their homes or work camps. But Canadians were very angry over how the government had treated the trekkers. Bennett, inspired by Roosevelt's New Deal, tried to win them back by promising minimum wage legislation, health and unemployment insurance, and more controls over banking and trade. But it was too little, too late. In the next election, Bennett's Conservatives were thrown out of power. Among the many articles of the Peace Treaty of Versailles, which settled the First World War, were severe restrictions on Germany's military muscle. The country was not allowed to have tanks, warplanes, submarines, large warships, or poison gas. It had to give all its war materials to the Allies, and the size of its military was restricted to a minimum for defense purposes only. When America's economy crashed in '29, U.S. bankers began calling in their loans all around the world. This was a particular problem for Germany because its recovering economy was built upon those loans. Without this support, the economy collapsed, companies went bankrupt, and unemployment soared. As many as 6 million people would be out of work by 1933. Recovery seemed hopeless. Except for the ideas of Adolf Hitler. His National Socialist Party came to power in 1933 and immediately set to work on Hitler's vision of a great revival for Germany. In a massive public works program, the Nazis built new roads and bridges and increased foreign trade, steel production, shipbuilding, and automobile production. Hitler's influence carried over into all aspects of German society: culture, education, economics, and family life. He also ignored completely the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. He built up his army, air force, and navy. He banned trade unions and any political parties other than his own National Socialist Party. And he launched a rearmament campaign on a scale never seen before. This combination of public works projects and the buildup in arms manufacturing quickly brought Germany out of the Depression. In 1939, the Nazi army occupied Czechoslovakia and launched a brutal invasion of Poland. Within 2 years, the influence of Hitler and his sympathetic allies included most of Europe. Britain and France declared war on Germany in 1939. British Commonwealth countries like Canada and Australia declared at the same time. The Depression ended in those countries when their factories began churning out munitions and war materials. A vast number of unemployed suddenly had jobs to go to and paychecks at the end of the week. Young men who hadn't worked in years put on uniforms and proudly headed for Europe. The United States resisted international pressure to join in the fight against the Nazis. All the while, people began to find work again in American factories producing arms and munitions for the Allies. But Roosevelt knew that joining in the fight was inevitable. Still, it wasn't Germany that brought the U.S. into the war. It was Japan. Early Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. In a surprise attack, the Japanese bombed the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within hours, Roosevelt declared a state of war with Japan.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Where had this conflict come from? Like most countries that enjoyed trading on a global scale, Japan was hit hard by the Depression. When the Tokyo government seemed to be incapable of dealing with the continuing high unemployment, the military took action on its own. Its solution was simple. Japan had to expand its territory, acquiring resources, raw materials, and heavy industries. In 1931, the Japanese military invaded Manchuria. 6 years later, the army was marching south through China in a brutal war of expansion. Japan thumbed its nose at the rest of the world's disapproval, well on the way to economic recovery. FDR wasn't impressed, and in June of 1941, America cut off its supply of oil to Japan. Japanese leaders were infuriated. They depended on imported oil to fuel Japan's military might. The Japanese then set their sights on the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Before invading, however, they had to remove the threat of the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet. So, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Four days later, Germany and Italy joined their Axis ally and declared war on the United States. As America geared up, more factories were opened, and assembly lines started churning out everything from bombs and planes to tanks and uniforms. The sheer amount of materials needed for the war guaranteed that everybody was going to be busy. The choice was simple. You became a soldier or went to work to support what soldiers had to do. The economy, already getting stronger because of FDR's New Deal, took off, and the Depression in America was over. How did the world change after the hard lessons of the Great Depression? For one thing, people began to hold their governments responsible for the performance of the economy. Almost every country affected by the Depression brought in new regulations to control the operation of banks and the stock market. Businesses began to pay closer attention to the long-term health of their markets, avoiding stockpiling and broadening their base. But perhaps the biggest change was in the area of global cooperation. As different countries realized just how dependent they were on each other, new organizations were created to encourage and protect international trade. And it's important to remember that the 30s weren't all doom and gloom. Even during the worst of it, most people were still employed. There was less money to go around, but people still had a good time. They still enjoyed their family and their friends. They loved to play and they loved to be entertained, from local talent shows to the latest Hollywood movies.
Take the stand.
I got it. Now what'll I do with it? Sit down.
Like a symbol of the times, dust storms continued to roll across the plains of North America throughout the Depression. The drought ended in 1939. As the rain soaked the earth and trees were planted to reduce erosion, farmers began to grow their crops again. And those who lived through the worst of those times carried with them a certain wariness, a look of suspicion that spoke of hard times and hunger, and of wasted years.